They called me the family pushover, the one who would never stand up for herself. But that day when the Deputy Attorney General looked directly at me and said those words that changed everything, my entire family finally understood who they had been dismissing all these years. I can still remember the exact moment their faces went white, the way my sister's mouth fell open, how my husband actually took a step backward like he was trying to disappear. The autumn air was crisp that October morning, cutting through the formal atmosphere of the courthouse steps, and I remember thinking how fitting it was that the leaves were changing colors just as my entire life was about to transform. My family had spent months telling me to get over it, to stop making such a big deal about things, to think about keeping the family together instead of being so selfish. But what they didn't know was that while they were busy defending my husband and my sister, I had been quietly building something they never could have imagined. The morning light caught the bronze nameplate on the courthouse door, and I realized that after 32 years of being the family disappointment, I was finally about to show them exactly who I really was. What happened next would leave them speechless for the first time in their lives. The truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, and mine was about to emerge in the most public way possible. For years, I had let them believe I was weak, but that morning they would learn just how wrong they had been. The person they thought they knew was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone they never saw coming. Before I share what happened that changed everything, I want to know you were here with me. Just say listening in the comments, or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches, especially when it involves standing up after being knocked down. My family had always seen me as the soft one, the peacekeeper who would bend over backward to avoid confrontation. When I married David 8 years ago, they loved him immediately because he was charming, successful, and knew exactly how to make everyone laugh. My sister Emma was always the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, with her perfect job in marketing and her ability to light up any room she entered. I was the quiet one who worked in what they called a boring government job, filing paperwork and attending meetings that nobody ever asked about. They never really understood what I did for work, and honestly, I never tried very hard to explain it to them. When family gatherings came around, David would regale everyone with stories from his sales job while Emma shared her latest adventures in the city. I would sit quietly, listening to their animated conversations about clients and campaigns, feeling invisible in my own family. My mother would always make comments about how I should learn from Emma, how I should try to be more outgoing like her, how I should appreciate having such a dynamic husband like David. The pattern had been set for years, with me as the reliable but unremarkable middle child who never quite measured up to everyone's expectations. The affair started 18 months ago, though I didn't discover it until 6 months later. I came home early from a work conference in Washington to find Emma's car in my driveway, and the house suspiciously quiet. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever imagined possible, not just because of David, but because it was my own sister. When I confronted them, they didn't even try to deny it, just looked at me with this mixture of guilt and defiance that made my stomach turn. Emma actually had the nerve to tell me that these things happen, that sometimes people just connect in ways they can't control. David stood there nodding, saying he never meant for it to happen, but that he and Emma had something special. I felt like I was drowning, watching my marriage and my relationship with my sister crumble in the same moment. That night, I called my mother, sobbing, expecting comfort and support, but instead she asked me what I had done to push David away. She suggested that maybe I hadn't been attentive enough, that I worked too much, that I should have seen this coming and done something to prevent it. When I told my father, he sighed heavily and said that marriage takes work from both people, implying that I was somehow equally responsible for my husband's affair with my sister. The family meeting happened 2 weeks later in my parents' house, and I walked in hoping finally to receive the support I desperately needed. Instead, I found myself facing a wall of people who seemed more concerned about David and Emma's feelings than mine. My mother had made David's favorite lasagna, and Emma was curled up on the couch like nothing had happened. They had been talking for over an hour before I arrived, and the atmosphere felt charged with discussions I hadn't been part of. My father cleared his throat and launched into what he called a practical conversation about keeping the family together. He talked about how divorce would hurt everyone, how Emma and David were both sorry, how I needed to think about forgiveness. My mother chimed in with comments about how holding grudges never helped anyone, how some marriages go through rough patches, how the important thing was moving forward. Emma sat there looking wounded, like she was the victim in this situation, occasionally wiping her eyes and talking about how terrible she felt. David kept apologizing, but his apologies were directed more toward my parents than toward me, as if he was more concerned about their approval than my pain. I tried to explain how betrayed I felt, how this wasn't just a rough patch, but a fundamental violation of trust by the two people who should have protected me most. But every time I spoke, someone would interrupt with reasons why I should be more understanding. My brother Mark, who had driven up from college, suggested that maybe this was an opportunity for growth, that maybe I was being too rigid in my thinking. My grandmother, who had always been my ally, was conspicuously quiet, occasionally shaking her head but never speaking up in my defense. The conversation continued for 3 hours, with me feeling more isolated and misunderstood with each passing minute. By the end, they had somehow made me feel like the unreasonable one for not immediately forgiving and forgetting. They painted David and Emma as star-crossed lovers who had fallen victim to circumstances beyond their control, while I was cast as the bitter wife who couldn't see past her own hurt feelings. When I left that night, I realized that my family had chosen sides, and I wasn't on the winning team. The months that followed were a blur of family gatherings where I felt like an outsider looking in. David and Emma would show up together, and everyone would act like it was perfectly normal while tiptoeing around me like I was a ticking time bomb. During my birthday dinner, my mother actually suggested that I should be grateful to have learned who my real friends were, implying that David leaving was somehow a blessing in disguise. Emma started bringing David to family events as her official boyfriend, and my parents welcomed him with open arms like he had always been their son-in-law. They would laugh at his jokes, ask about his work, and treat him exactly the same as they always had. Meanwhile, I felt like I was disappearing, becoming more invisible at every gathering. My attempts to talk about my feelings were met with uncomfortable silence or suggestions that I should consider therapy to work through my anger. They made it clear that my ongoing hurt was becoming an inconvenience to everyone else's comfort. What my family didn't know was that my boring government job was actually something quite different from what they imagined. For the past 5 years, I had been working as a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime and public corruption cases. My law degree from Georgetown, which I had earned through night school while working full-time, was something I had never really discussed at family gatherings. When they asked about my work, I would give vague answers about paperwork and meetings because the details of ongoing investigations were confidential. My cases involved complex financial crimes, political corruption, and corporate fraud that required years of careful investigation and preparation. The conference I had returned from early, the one that led me to discover the affair, was actually a multi-state task force meeting about a major embezzlement case involving several prominent businessmen. My colleagues knew me as someone who was thorough, relentless, and absolutely committed to seeking justice for victims of financial crimes. But to my family, I was just quiet little me with my boring office job. The case that would change everything had been building for over 2 years, involving a network of corrupt city officials and business leaders who had been skimming money from public works projects. As the lead prosecutor, I had spent countless hours reviewing financial records, interviewing witnesses, and building an airtight case against some very powerful people. The investigation had required absolute secrecy, which meant I couldn't talk about my work with anyone, including my family. My late nights at the office, which David had complained about during our marriage, were actually spent preparing for what would become one of the most significant corruption cases in the state's recent history. The trial had been scheduled for months, with media attention building as word leaked about the high-profile defendants involved. Local news stations have been following the story, and legal experts were calling it a watershed moment for accountability in local government. The morning of the verdict, I knew that everything was about to change, not just for the defendants, but for my own life as well. The irony wasn't lost on me. that while my family was treating me like I couldn't handle my own personal problems, I was actually responsible for taking down some of the most corrupt individuals in the city. My colleagues had nominated me for a state prosecution award based on my work on this case, an honor that would be announced publicly regardless of the trial's outcome. The Attorney General himself had called to congratulate me on the quality of the investigation, praising my attention to detail and my commitment to justice. But none of this mattered to my family, who saw only what they expected to see: a quiet woman who couldn't even keep her husband from cheating with her own sister. They had no idea that judges respected my legal arguments, that defense attorneys feared facing me in court, that my reputation in the legal community was built on a foundation of successful prosecutions and ethical integrity. The disconnect between how my family saw me and who I actually was had never been more apparent. The morning of October 15th started like any other day, with me preparing for what I knew would be a media circus at the courthouse. The corruption trial had attracted reporters from every major news outlet in the state, and the courthouse steps were lined with cameras and microphones. I had been handling high-profile cases for years, but this one felt different because of the public attention and the significance of the charges involved. My closing argument the previous week had been described by legal reporters as masterful, a carefully constructed presentation that laid out the evidence in terms that even the most skeptical juror could understand. The defendants included a former city councilman, 2 prominent contractors, and a bank executive who had all worked together to funnel public money into their private accounts. The evidence was overwhelming, with paper trails, recorded conversations, and witness testimony that painted a clear picture of systematic corruption spanning several years. As I walked up the courthouse steps that morning, I thought about how surreal it was that my family had no idea what was about to happen. They were probably getting ready for another awkward family dinner, where they would continue to treat David and Emma like the victims, while making me feel guilty for not getting over my hurt feelings. My mother had called the night before to remind me about my cousin's wedding next month, mentioning casually that David and Emma would be there together and hoping I wouldn't make things uncomfortable for everyone. The casual cruelty of that comment had stung, but I had learned to expect nothing different from them. They had made their choice months ago, and I had learned to live with the fact that my own family saw me as the problem rather than the victim. But today was going to be different in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The courtroom was packed with spectators, attorneys, and reporters, all waiting to hear the jury's decision in what had become known as the municipal corruption trial. I sat at the prosecution table with my co-counsel, reviewing my notes one final time and trying to stay calm despite the magnitude of the moment. The defendants sat across the room with their expensive legal teams, looking confident despite the mountain of evidence against them. Judge Harrison, who had presided over the entire trial with fairness and patience, called the court to order as the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman stood up with the verdict forms in his hand, and I felt my heart racing as we waited to hear whether months of investigation and preparation had resulted in justice for the taxpayers who had been robbed by these corrupt officials. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as everyone held their breath, waiting for words that would either validate or crush everything we had worked toward. Guilty on all counts. The words rang through the courtroom like thunder, and I felt a surge of satisfaction and relief that was almost overwhelming. The defendants' faces went white as the full weight of their convictions settled in, while their attorneys immediately began discussing appeals and sentencing recommendations. The spectator gallery erupted in whispers and movement as reporters began frantically typing on their phones and laptops. Judge Harrison thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month, then dismissed the court with a bang of his gavel that seemed to echo forever. As people began filing out of the courtroom, I gathered my files and prepared for the media interviews that I knew would follow. This was the moment I had been working toward for over 2 years, the culmination of an investigation that had consumed my professional life and was about to thrust me into the public spotlight in a way my family never could have anticipated. The courthouse steps were chaos, with reporters shoving microphones toward me and cameras clicking constantly as I emerged into the bright autumn sunlight. The questions came rapid fire, asking about the significance of the convictions, the impact on local government, and my role in building the case that had brought down such powerful figures. I answered each question carefully and professionally, explaining the legal principles involved and the importance of holding public officials accountable for their actions. The Deputy Attorney General, who had driven down specifically for the verdict announcement, stepped up to the microphone cluster and began praising the prosecution team's work. He mentioned my leadership on the case, my years of dedicated service, and my reputation as one of the most effective prosecutors in the state. The cameras focused on me as he spoke, and I realized that my face and name were about to be broadcast across every news outlet in the region. What I didn't know was that my family was watching. My mother later told me that she had been channel surfing during her lunch break when she saw a familiar face on the news. At first, she couldn't believe it was actually me standing there in my professional suit, fielding questions from reporters about a major corruption case. My father was working from home and had the local news on in the background when he heard my name mentioned as the lead prosecutor. Emma was at her office when a colleague mentioned seeing her sister on the news, and David was having lunch with clients when someone at the next table started discussing the trial verdict and mentioned the prosecutor's name. One by one, my family members were discovering that the quiet, unremarkable woman they had been dismissing for months was actually making headlines as the attorney who had just taken down some of the most corrupt officials in the city. The Deputy Attorney General's words were being broadcast live across multiple networks, and his praise for my work was specific and glowing. He talked about my tireless dedication to justice, my brilliant legal mind, and my unwavering ethical standards in pursuing this complex case. He mentioned my role in securing justice for taxpayers who have been robbed by corrupt officials, and he spoke about my reputation among colleagues as someone who never backed down from powerful defendants. As he continued speaking, I could see the reporters taking notes and the cameras recording every word. This wasn't just a routine press conference. It was a moment that would define my professional reputation and establish me as a serious legal force in the state. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family had been treating me like I couldn't handle my personal problems, I was being publicly praised for my ability to handle some of the most complex legal challenges in the state. The questions from reporters continued for nearly 30 minutes, covering everything from the investigative techniques we had used to the broader implications for government accountability. I found myself explaining legal concepts and discussing the importance of prosecutorial integrity while cameras rolled and reporters scribbled notes furiously. One reporter asked about the personal cost of pursuing such a high-profile case, and I mentioned the long hours and the sacrifice required to build a case of this complexity. Another asked about my background and experience, leading me to discuss my law degree and my years of experience in federal prosecution. With each answer, I could feel myself stepping further into a public role that my family had never known existed. The woman they thought they knew was disappearing, replaced by someone they had never bothered to discover. As the press conference wound down, I knew that the story would be everywhere within hours. The evening news would feature extensive coverage of the verdict and the prosecution team's role in securing justice. My name and face would be associated with one of the most significant legal victories in recent memory, and my professional reputation would be established beyond any doubt. The quiet government worker my family thought they knew was about to be revealed as someone entirely different, someone who commanded respect in courtrooms and whose legal expertise was sought after by colleagues across the state. The transformation was already beginning, and I could sense that everything was about to change in ways my family couldn't possibly prepare for. I walked back toward the courthouse to collect my remaining files and prepare for the follow-up work that would continue for weeks. The defendants would undoubtedly appeal their convictions, requiring additional legal briefs and court appearances. The media attention would continue as the story developed and sentencing approached. My phone was already buzzing with messages from colleagues, congratulations from other prosecutors, and interview requests from legal publications. The professional recognition I had earned through years of hard work was finally becoming public, and I realized that my family would have no choice but to see me differently. The person they had dismissed and overlooked was about to step into a spotlight that would illuminate exactly who I had been all along, someone they had never bothered to truly know or understand. The afternoon sun was setting as I finally headed home, knowing that my phone would be ringing constantly with calls from family members who had seen the news coverage. They would finally understand that their boring sister with a government job was actually someone who commanded respect and recognition in ways they had never imagined. The woman they thought was too weak to handle her marriage problems had just demonstrated her ability to take on corrupt politicians and win decisively. Tonight would bring conversations that would change our family dynamic forever, as they realized they had been wrong about me in every possible way. The quiet strength they had mistaken for weakness was about to be revealed as something much more powerful, and their comfortable assumptions about who I was were about to be shattered completely. My phone started ringing before I even reached my car, and the first call was from my mother, her voice higher pitched than I had ever heard it. She was stumbling over her words, asking if she had really seen me on the news, if I was really the prosecutor everyone was talking about. I could hear the television still playing in the background, and she kept pausing to listen to the continued coverage of the trial. My father picked up the extension, his usual confident voice replaced by something confused and almost apologetic. They bombarded me with questions I had never heard from them before, asking about my education, my career, my cases, as if they were meeting me for the first time. For 32 years they had lived with me, raised me, attended family dinners with me, but they had never once asked these questions. The irony was overwhelming, that it took a public news broadcast for my own parents to become curious about who their daughter actually was. I drove home slowly, letting the phone ring as more calls came in from family members who had seen the coverage. My voicemail filled up quickly with messages from Emma, David, my brother Mark, my grandmother, even cousins I hadn't spoken to in months. Each message had the same tone of shock and disbelief, as if they couldn't reconcile the person they thought they knew with the professional they had seen on television. Emma's message was particularly telling, her voice shaky as she asked why I had never told anyone about being a prosecutor, why I had let them think I was just a paper pusher in some government office. The question revealed everything about how they saw me and how little they had ever bothered to look deeper. I had never hidden my career from them. I had simply stopped trying to explain it when their eyes glazed over with disinterest whenever I mentioned work. The truth was that I had tried to share my professional life with them in the early years, but they had made it clear that my accomplishments weren't as interesting or important as David's sales stories or Emma's marketing campaigns. When I graduated from law school after 6 years of night classes, my family attended the ceremony, but spent the reception talking about Emma's new promotion and David's latest business deal. When I passed the bar exam on my first try, my mother mentioned it briefly at Sunday dinner before launching into a detailed discussion of my brother's college courses. When I won my first major case 3 years ago, I tried to explain the significance over family dinner, but the conversation quickly shifted to David's golf tournament and Emma's vacation plans. Over time, I learned that my professional achievements weren't welcome topics at family gatherings. So I stopped bringing them up and let them believe whatever they wanted to believe about my boring government job. The Georgetown law degree hanging in my office had taken 6 years to earn while working full-time at the prosecutor's office as a paralegal. I attended classes 4 nights a week and spent weekends studying in the law library, sacrificing every social opportunity and personal relationship to chase a dream my family thought was unrealistic. They had questioned why I wanted to go to law school at all, suggesting that I should focus on finding a husband and starting a family like other women my age. When I explained that I wanted to prosecute criminals and fight for justice, they exchanged glances that suggested they thought I was being naive and overly ambitious. David was supportive in the beginning, but as the years wore on and my studies demanded more time and energy, he began complaining that I was never available for his work events or social gatherings. My family sided with him, suggesting that I was being selfish by pursuing a career that left so little time for the people who mattered most. Even after I graduated and began working as a prosecutor, they continued to treat my career as a phase I would eventually outgrow. My mother would introduce me to people as her daughter who worked for the government, never mentioning that I was an attorney or that I prosecuted serious criminal cases. When strangers asked follow-up questions about my work, she would quickly change the subject or give vague answers that minimized what I actually did. My father would occasionally joke that I was probably just pushing papers around some government office, never realizing that his joke contained a kernel of genuine belief about my capabilities and importance. Emma would tell people that her sister worked in law, but was really more of an administrator than anything significant. They had created their own version of who I was, and nothing I said or did seemed capable of changing that perception. The corruption case that had just concluded was actually my fourth major prosecution victory in the past 3 years, but my family had no knowledge of any of them. 2 years ago, I had successfully prosecuted a pharmaceutical executive who had been bribing doctors to prescribe unnecessary medications to elderly patients. The case had received statewide media attention and resulted in new regulations protecting vulnerable patients from corporate exploitation. 18 months ago, I had led the prosecution team that brought down a construction company owner who had been using substandard materials in public schools, putting thousands of children at risk. That case had resulted in criminal convictions and civil settlements that funded safety improvements in school districts across the state. Last year, I had prosecuted a group of financial advisors who had been stealing retirement savings from their clients, recovering millions of dollars for elderly victims who had trusted these criminals with their life savings. Each of these cases had required months or years of investigation, complex legal preparation, and the ability to present complicated evidence to juries in ways they could understand and act upon. My colleagues in the prosecutor's office knew me as someone who could handle the most challenging cases, someone who never backed down from powerful defendants with expensive legal teams. The judges I appeared before regularly had learned to expect thorough preparation, ethical conduct, and compelling legal arguments whenever I walked into their courtrooms. The defense attorneys who faced me knew they were up against someone who had done her homework and wouldn't be intimidated by their tactics or their client's influence. But my family knew none of this because they had never bothered to ask, and I had eventually stopped trying to tell them. The disconnect between my professional reputation and my family's perception of me had become particularly painful during the months when they were defending David and Emma's affair. While they were treating me like someone too weak and naive to handle adult relationships, I was actually preparing for the most complex case of my career. The corruption investigation had involved coordinating with federal agencies, state regulators, and local law enforcement to build a comprehensive case against defendants who had significant political and financial resources. I had spent countless hours reviewing financial records, interviewing witnesses, and preparing legal briefs while my family was telling me I needed to be more understanding of my cheating husband and my betraying sister. The irony was excruciating, being lectured about handling my personal problems by people who had no idea I was trusted to handle some of the most serious legal challenges in the state. My work on the corruption case had actually helped me cope with the betrayal at home, giving me a sense of purpose and accomplishment that my crumbling marriage couldn't provide. While David and Emma were carrying on their affair and my family was making excuses for them, I was building a case that would protect taxpayers from criminals who thought they were untouchable. The late nights at the office that David had complained about were actually spent interviewing witnesses who were brave enough to come forward against powerful defendants. The weekend work sessions that my family criticized were actually strategy meetings with federal investigators who were coordinating related cases in other jurisdictions. My dedication to seeking justice for victims of corruption had given me strength during the darkest period of my personal life. But my family saw only someone who was too career-focused to properly maintain her marriage. The phone kept ringing as I sat in my driveway, and I could see text messages lighting up my screen from family members who wanted explanations for what they had seen on the news. David had sent 3 messages asking why I had never told him about being involved in such important cases, conveniently forgetting all the times he had dismissed my work as boring government bureaucracy. Emma's texts were full of questions about my education and career, as if she was trying to piece together a puzzle she had never bothered to examine before. My brother Mark had sent a screenshot of a news article about the case with question marks, apparently unable to believe that his quiet older sister was the prosecutor being quoted in major news stories. The sudden interest in my professional life felt hollow and opportunistic, coming only after they had seen me validated by external sources they couldn't dismiss or ignore. My grandmother called while I was still sitting in the car, and her voice was different from the others, filled with pride rather than shock. She told me she had always known I was special, that she had watched me work through law school and wondered why the family never talked about my achievements. She admitted that she had felt uncomfortable during the family meetings about David and Emma, knowing that I was being treated unfairly, but not knowing how to speak up against the rest of the family. Her words were the first genuine support I had received from anyone in my family since the affair had been discovered, and I found myself crying in my driveway as she told me how proud she was of the woman I had become. She had seen what the others had missed, the strength and determination that had carried me through law school and built my career, but her voice had been drowned out by the louder opinions of parents and siblings who thought they knew better. As I finally walked into my house, I thought about all the times I had sat quietly at family dinners while they celebrated David's sales achievements and Emma's marketing successes, never mentioning my own professional victories because I knew they wouldn't be received with the same enthusiasm. I remembered the family gathering where David had spent an hour talking about landing a new client while I sat silently, fresh from a courtroom victory that had resulted in justice for fraud victims, but knowing better than to compete for attention. I thought about the birthday party where Emma had dominated the conversation with stories from her corporate retreat, while I had just returned from a conference where I had been recognized by other prosecutors for my ethical standards and legal expertise. My family's hierarchy of importance had been established long ago, and my achievements had never fit into their framework of what mattered or deserved recognition. The evening news was starting, and I knew that my family would be watching every channel, trying to understand how they had so completely misunderstood who I was and what I did for work. The lead story was the corruption conviction, with extensive coverage of the trial and the prosecution team's role in bringing the defendants to justice. My photo appeared on screen alongside quotes from the Deputy Attorney General praising my leadership and dedication to the case. The reporter mentioned my years of experience prosecuting white-collar criminals and my reputation for taking on cases that other prosecutors might avoid because of their complexity or the power of the defendants involved. This public validation of my professional competence was reaching my family through their television screens, forcing them to confront the reality that they had been wrong about me in fundamental ways. The doorbell rang just after 8 o'clock, and I looked through the peephole to see my parents standing on my front porch, looking nervous and uncertain in a way I had never seen before. My mother was clutching her purse tightly, and my father kept checking his phone as if he was still trying to process what he had learned about me that day. I opened the door to find them both trying to smile, but their expressions were complicated by something that looked like embarrassment mixed with confusion. They asked if they could come in, using the polite tone they typically reserve for people they didn't know very well, and I realized that in some ways they were meeting their daughter for the first time. The casual dismissal that had characterized their treatment of me for months was gone, replaced by something that resembled respect but felt awkward and unfamiliar coming from them. They sat in my living room looking around as if they were seeing it for the first time, noticing the framed law degree on the wall, the legal books on my shelves, the case files neatly organized on my desk. My mother asked about the degree, admitting that she had never really understood what Georgetown Law School meant or why I had worked so hard to get there. My father picked up one of my legal journals and flipped through it, commenting that he had no idea I read such complicated material or dealt with such serious issues in my work. They were like tourists in my life, exploring a landscape they had never bothered to notice despite living next to it for years. Their questions were tentative and respectful, so different from their usual assumptions and interruptions, and I realized they were finally seeing me as someone whose opinions and expertise might actually matter. My mother brought up the affair almost hesitantly, her voice smaller than usual as she acknowledged that maybe they hadn't been as supportive as they should have been. She mentioned seeing me on television and realizing that I was probably dealing with much more stress than they had understood juggling a high-pressure career with personal betrayal from the people closest to me. My father cleared his throat and admitted that they might have been too focused on keeping the family together to properly consider what I was going through individually. These weren't full apologies, but they were the closest thing to acknowledgement I had received from them since the whole mess started. They were beginning to understand that the daughter they had dismissed as too weak to handle her marriage problems was actually strong enough to handle criminal prosecutions that made headlines across the state. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with them asking questions about my education, my cases, my colleagues, and my reputation in the legal community. They wanted to know about the corruption case, how long I had been working on it, what it meant for my career, and why I had never shared any of this information with them. I explained that I had tried to share my professional life with them in the past, but their lack of interest had eventually taught me to keep my work separate from family gatherings. They looked uncomfortable at this explanation, perhaps recognizing their own role in creating the distance between us. My mother mentioned that she wished she had known about my achievements so she could have been proud of them, apparently not realizing that her pride shouldn't have been contingent on external validation or public recognition. As they prepared to leave, my father said something that revealed just how completely they had misunderstood me all these years. He told me he was impressed by my success and wondered if I had learned to be so strong and determined because of the challenges with David and Emma. I had to explain that my strength and determination had been there all along, that my professional achievements have been building for years, and that my ability to handle difficult situations had been demonstrated repeatedly in courtrooms long before my marriage fell apart. The idea that my strength was somehow new or reactive to recent events showed how little they had really seen or understood about who I was. My competence and resilience weren't recent developments. They were foundational aspects of my personality that had been invisible to my family because they had never bothered to look. After they left, I sat in my quiet house and thought about how strange it felt to have my own parents treat me with something resembling respect for the first time in my adult life. The public recognition had forced them to see me differently, but it also highlighted how wrong they had been about me for so long. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more questions, more awkward attempts to reconcile their assumptions with the reality of who I actually was. Emma and David would undoubtedly want to have their own conversations, probably trying to reframe their behavior in light of what they had learned about my professional life. The family dynamics that had been established over years of dismissal and misunderstanding were beginning to shift, but I wondered if the changes would be lasting or just temporary reactions to unwelcome surprises. The next morning brought a new wave of attention, as the corruption story continued to develop and my role in the prosecution received additional coverage. Legal experts were discussing the case on television, praising the thorough investigation and the strength of the evidence that had led to convictions. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from legal publications, speaking opportunities at law schools, and congratulations from colleagues across the state. The professional recognition that my family had never witnessed was now impossible to ignore, broadcast repeatedly on every news channel and discussed in every newspaper. The quiet government worker they thought they knew was being revealed as someone with a reputation and expertise that extended far beyond anything they had imagined. Emma called around noon, her voice different from any conversation we had ever had, filled with something that sounded like mixed with regret. She asked detailed questions about my career, my education, and my cases, as if she was trying to understand how she had missed so much about her own sister. She mentioned feeling foolish for never realizing how accomplished I was, for never asking the right questions about my work, for assuming that her marketing career was somehow more significant than whatever I was doing in government. The conversation was awkward and stilted, with long pauses where she seemed to be processing information that challenged everything she thought she knew about our relationship. She didn't apologize for the affair, but there was something in her voice that suggested she was beginning to understand that she had betrayed someone much more important than she had realized. David's call came later that afternoon, and his tone was the most complicated of all, mixing his usual charm with something that sounded almost like intimidation. He asked about the cases I had prosecuted, the types of criminals I had put in prison, and the power I had in the legal system. His questions felt different from the others, more calculating and less genuinely curious, as if he was trying to assess what my professional capabilities might mean for him personally. When he mentioned the corruption case, there was something in his voice that suggested he was wondering what other investigations I might be involved in or what connections I might have to people who could cause problems for someone like him. The conversation left me feeling unsettled, as if David was beginning to see me not just as the wife he had betrayed, but as someone who might have resources and capabilities that could make his life complicated. The weekend brought the family gathering I had been dreading, my cousin's wedding where David and Emma would be attending together while I would be there alone. But everything had changed since the news coverage, and I knew that this would be the first family event where people would see me differently. My extended family had been calling all week, asking about the case and my career, expressing surprise that they had never known about my professional achievements. Cousins who had barely spoken to me at previous gatherings were suddenly interested in my work, my education, and my opinions on legal issues. The family hierarchy that had positioned me as the quiet, unremarkable middle child was being challenged by external validation that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. I spent Friday evening preparing for the wedding, choosing my outfit carefully and thinking about how different this gathering would be from all the others. For the first time in years, I wouldn't be the family member everyone felt sorry for or made excuses about. I wouldn't be the quiet one sitting in the corner while others dominated conversations about their achievements and adventures. I would be walking into that room as someone whose professional accomplishments have been publicly recognized and celebrated, someone whose expertise and reputation extended far beyond the small world of family dynamics and petty jealousies. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but it had begun in ways that would be impossible to reverse. The wedding was tomorrow, and I knew that David and Emma would be there together, probably still expecting to be treated as the couple everyone should support and understand. But the family members who had been defending them and criticizing me had spent the week learning things about me that complicated their simple narrative. The woman they had dismissed as too weak to handle her marriage problems had been revealed as someone strong enough to take on corrupt politicians and win decisively. The boring government worker they thought they knew had been exposed as a respected prosecutor whose professional reputation commanded attention from colleagues across the state. Tomorrow would be the first time we would all be in the same room since these revelations, and I sensed that the comfortable assumptions everyone had been making were about to be tested in ways no one was prepared for. I walked into the wedding reception with my head held high, wearing the navy blue dress that had always made me feel confident and professional. The moment I entered the room, I could feel the shift in energy, the way conversations paused and heads turned in my direction. My cousin Sarah rushed over immediately. Her face lit up with excitement as she told me how proud the whole family was after seeing me on the news all week. Uncle Jim, who had barely acknowledged me at previous gatherings, came over to shake my hand and tell me how impressed he was by my accomplishments. Aunt Linda, who usually spent family events discussing her children's achievements while ignoring mine, wanted to know all about my cases and my career. The attention felt surreal after years of being overlooked and dismissed, but I accepted their congratulations graciously while scanning the room for the people I knew would be struggling with this new reality. David and Emma were standing near the bar, and I could see them watching my interactions with the extended family with expressions I had never seen before. David looked uncomfortable in a way that went beyond normal awkwardness, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that resembled nervousness. Emma kept fidgeting with her jewelry and glancing around the room as if she was looking for an escape route. They were still together, still presenting themselves as the couple my parents had been defending, but something fundamental had changed in how they were being received by the rest of the family. Cousins who had previously treated David like a charming addition to family gatherings were now giving him polite but cooler greetings. Family members who had always adored Emma were asking pointed questions about how she was doing and whether she was happy with her recent choices. My grandmother approached me with tears in her eyes, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than any embrace we had shared in years. She whispered that she had always known I was special, that she had watched me work through law school with such determination and wondered why no one else seemed to notice or care. She told me that seeing me on television had made her prouder than she had ever been of any grandchild, not because of the public recognition, but because it finally proved what she had always believed about my character and capabilities. Her words meant more to me than all the congratulations from cousins and aunts who had suddenly discovered my existence after seeing me validated by external sources. She had seen my worth when others couldn't or wouldn't, and her validation felt genuine rather than opportunistic. The bride, my cousin Michelle, made a point of introducing me to her new in-laws as the prosecutor in the family, the one who had just won that big corruption case they had been hearing about on the news. Her pride in my accomplishments was evident as she described my career to people who had never met me before, and I found myself in conversations about legal issues, criminal justice, and my experiences in courtrooms across the state. These were the kinds of conversations I had always wanted to have at family gatherings, but had learned to avoid because my professional life had never been considered interesting or important enough to discuss. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to hear about my work, my cases, and my opinions on legal matters that affected their communities. My parents hovered nearby, clearly wanting to be part of these conversations, but seeming uncertain about how to participate. They had spent years dismissing my career as boring government work, and now they were watching extended family members treat me like an expert whose opinions mattered. My mother kept trying to insert herself into discussions about my achievements, claiming credit for supporting my education and career choices in ways that directly contradicted my memories of her discouragement and lack of interest. My father nodded along when people praised my accomplishments, but I could see the confusion in his eyes as he tried to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the professional who was commanding respect from everyone in the room. The contrast between how I was being treated now and how I had been treated at the last family gathering was stark and uncomfortable for everyone who had been part of those earlier conversations. Cousins who had remained silent when my marriage was being discussed were now eager to hear my perspective on complex legal issues. Family members who had treated David as the victim of my unreasonable expectations were now giving him cautious, measured interactions that suggested their opinions had shifted significantly. The simple narrative that had painted David and Emma as star-crossed lovers and me as the bitter ex-wife was being complicated by information that forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about who deserved sympathy and support. David finally approached me during the cocktail hour, his usual charm replaced by something more careful and calculated. He complimented my recent success and mentioned how proud he was of my achievements, conveniently forgetting all the times he had complained about my work schedule and minimized the importance of my career. His words felt hollow and manipulative, designed to position himself as supportive rather than dismissive of my professional life. When he suggested that we should talk privately about our situation, there was something in his tone that suggested he was hoping my newfound status might somehow benefit him, or that I might be willing to overlook his betrayal now that I was receiving public recognition for my work. I responded to David with the same polite professionalism I used with defense attorneys in court, acknowledging his comments without engaging emotionally or personally. I told him that our divorce proceedings were being handled by my attorney and that any communication should go through proper legal channels. My tone was calm and measured, the voice of someone who dealt with difficult people professionally and knew how to maintain boundaries without losing composure. Several family members overheard this exchange, and I could see them processing the contrast between David's desperate charm and my composed authority. The dynamic between us had shifted completely, with me clearly holding the position of strength and control while he scrambled to maintain relevance and influence. Emma's approach was different, more emotional, and seemingly genuine in her distress about how things had unfolded between us. She told me she had no idea how accomplished I was, how much I had achieved, how impressive my career had become. She claimed that if she had known about my professional success, she never would have gotten involved with David, as if my worth as a person was somehow dependent on external validation of my achievements. Her apology felt conditional and self-serving, based not on recognition that she had betrayed her sister, but on belated understanding that she had betrayed someone important. The implication that my value had somehow increased because of public recognition revealed everything about how she had always seen me and why she had felt comfortable destroying our relationship. I listened to Emma's rambling apology with the same calm attention I gave to witnesses in court, neither accepting nor rejecting her words, but simply letting her reveal her character through her own statements. When she finished speaking, I told her that I appreciated her acknowledgement, but that our relationship had been fundamentally damaged by choices that had nothing to do with my career or public recognition. I explained that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired by retroactive respect or belated understanding of someone's worth. My response was measured and final. The words of someone who had learned to protect herself from people who only valued her when it served their interests. The dinner portion of the reception provided even more evidence of how completely the family dynamics had shifted since the news coverage began. I was seated at the head table with other accomplished family members, rather than relegated to the peripheral tables where I had been placed at previous gatherings. Conversations throughout the meal centered around my career, my cases, and my insights into legal issues affecting the community. David and Emma, meanwhile, found themselves seated at a table with younger cousins and distant relatives, no longer occupying the central position they had enjoyed when my parents were actively promoting their relationship. During the toasts, my uncle Michael mentioned me specifically, praising the family's pride in having a prosecutor who was making such an important contribution to justice in the community. He talked about my dedication, my integrity, and my success in taking on powerful criminals who thought they were above the law. The room erupted in applause, and I felt a warmth I had never experienced at a family gathering, the genuine pride and respect that I had always hoped to receive but had learned to live without. This public acknowledgement of my worth wasn't dependent on external validation or news coverage. It was based on understanding and appreciation of who I had always been but had never been allowed to show. My grandmother requested the microphone during the open toast portion, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the entire reception. She talked about watching me work through law school while raising a family and maintaining a demanding job, never complaining or asking for special treatment. She mentioned my quiet strength, my determination to help others, and my commitment to justice that had driven every decision in my professional life. She said that seeing me on television had been wonderful, but knowing the person behind the achievements had always been the real source of her pride. Her words brought tears to my eyes because they recognized not just my accomplishments, but the character and values that had motivated them. The evening continued with family members approaching me to apologize for not understanding my career better, for not asking the right questions, for not recognizing my achievements sooner. These conversations were awkward but necessary, revealing how completely they had misunderstood both my capabilities and my worth as a person. Some of the apologies felt genuine, rooted in real regret about missed opportunities to know me better. Others felt more calculated, designed to position the speakers favorably now that my status had been publicly established. I accepted them all graciously, but without the enthusiasm they seemed to expect, understanding that relationships built on public recognition rather than genuine interest weren't particularly valuable or sustainable. My parents spent the evening trying to insert themselves into conversations about my success, claiming credit for my achievements, and attempting to rewrite history about their support for my career. They told anyone who would listen about how proud they had always been, how they had encouraged my education, how they had known I would be successful someday. These claims were so far from reality that several family members looked confused, clearly remembering different versions of events from previous gatherings. I didn't contradict their revisionist history publicly, but I also didn't validate it, simply letting their words stand as evidence of their character and priorities. David made several more attempts to engage me throughout the evening, each interaction revealing his growing desperation as he realized that his position in the family hierarchy had fundamentally shifted. He tried to reminisce about our early relationship, attempted to take credit for supporting my career, and even suggested that we might be able to work things out now that we both understood each other better. Each overture was met with the same professional politeness I reserved for opposing counsel, respectful but firm in maintaining appropriate boundaries. His charm, which had once been so effective with my family, now seemed hollow and manipulative when contrasted with my quiet dignity and genuine accomplishments. Emma's behavior became increasingly erratic as the evening progressed, and she realized that her relationship with David was being viewed very differently by family members who had learned to respect me. Several cousins asked her pointed questions about her choices, wondering how she could have betrayed a sister who was clearly such an accomplished and admirable person. The simple narrative that had positioned her as someone following her heart was being replaced by a more complex understanding of her actions as a betrayal of someone worthy of loyalty and respect. She began drinking more heavily and making comments that revealed her jealousy and resentment about the attention I was receiving. The contrast between Emma's deteriorating behavior and my composed presence became more obvious as the night continued. While she became louder and more defensive about her choices, I remained calm and gracious, accepting congratulations and engaging in meaningful conversations about legal issues and community concerns. Family members began drawing their own conclusions about our respective characters, seeing past the surface charm that had once made Emma seem like the more appealing sister. My quiet strength, which they had previously mistaken for weakness, was now being recognized as the foundation of my professional success and personal integrity. Near the end of the reception, the bride's father approached me to ask about my willingness to speak at a community event about criminal justice reform. He had been impressed by my insights during our dinner conversation and thought the community would benefit from hearing my perspective on legal issues affecting local government. This invitation represented exactly the kind of recognition and respect I had always wanted from my family, but it was coming from someone who had met me just hours earlier and taken the time to understand my expertise and values. The irony wasn't lost on me that strangers were more interested in my professional opinions than my own family had ever been. As the evening wound down, I found myself surrounded by extended family members who wanted to maintain connections with me, exchange contact information, and continue conversations about legal issues affecting their communities. These relationships felt more genuine and valuable than the superficial interactions I had endured for years with immediate family members who had never bothered to know or understand me. The public recognition had opened doors to authentic connections based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than obligatory family ties, maintained despite indifference and dismissal. David made one final attempt to corner me as I was preparing to leave, his desperation now obvious to anyone watching. He asked if we could meet privately to discuss our future, suggesting that recent events had given him new perspective on our relationship and my value as a person. His words revealed everything about how he had always seen me and why he had felt comfortable betraying me with my sister. The fact that his interest in reconciliation coincided exactly with my public recognition showed that his feelings had nothing to do with love or genuine regret and everything to do with opportunism and social positioning. I responded to David's final plea with the same calm authority I used in closing arguments, explaining that our marriage had ended when he chose to have an affair with my sister, and that no amount of retroactive appreciation or public recognition could repair that fundamental breach of trust. I told him that I had learned to value myself independently of other people's opinions or recognition, and that his sudden interest in my worth was irrelevant to my decision-making process. My words were clear, final, and delivered without anger or bitterness, the response of someone who had found her own strength and no longer needed validation from people who had failed to appreciate her. As I drove home from the wedding, I reflected on how completely the evening had vindicated my quiet belief in my own worth, even when that worth had been invisible to the people closest to me. The family members who had dismissed me for months were now scrambling to reposition themselves as supporters and admirers, but their sudden change of heart felt hollow and manipulative rather than genuine. The recognition that mattered most had come from my grandmother, who had always seen my value, and from extended family members who had taken the time to understand my accomplishments and character rather than simply reacting to external validation. The transformation was complete, but not entirely satisfying, because it had been driven by public recognition rather than genuine appreciation of who I had always been. My professional success had forced my family to see me differently, but it had also revealed the conditional nature of their respect and affection. They valued me now because other people valued me, not because they had taken the time to understand my character, my dedication, or my contributions to justice and community welfare. This belated recognition felt both vindicating and hollow, proving that I had been right about my worth, while simultaneously highlighting how wrong they had been about everything that mattered. The weeks following the wedding brought a series of awkward conversations with family members who were still trying to adjust to their new understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. My parents called regularly, asking about my cases and my career with the enthusiasm of people trying to make up for years of indifference and dismissal. Emma sent several text messages attempting to rebuild our relationship, each one revealing her continued inability to understand that trust and respect couldn't be restored through belated acknowledgement of my accomplishments. David's attorney contacted mine with settlement proposals that suggested he was eager to finalize our divorce and move on with his life, probably realizing that his chances of reconciliation had disappeared completely. My professional life continued to flourish with speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, and recognition from legal organizations that had taken notice of my work on high-profile cases. The corruption prosecution had established my reputation beyond the local legal community, leading to invitations to speak at law schools and participate in panels on government accountability and prosecutorial ethics. These opportunities represented the kind of professional recognition I had always worked toward, validation based on competence and integrity rather than family connections or social positioning. The respect of colleagues and legal experts felt more meaningful than the belated approval of family members who had never bothered to understand my work or my values. The final vindication came 6 months later when I was nominated for a State Prosecutorial Excellence Award, recognition that would be presented at a ceremony attended by judges, attorneys, and government officials from across the state. My family learned about the nomination through news coverage, just as they had learned about my previous accomplishments, and they called to express their pride and excitement about attending the ceremony. I thanked them for their support, but explained that my guest tickets would be going to colleagues who had supported my work over the years, people who had recognized my value long before it became publicly obvious. This decision represented my final break from the pattern of seeking approval from people who had consistently failed to appreciate or understand me. The ceremony would celebrate achievements that my family had never bothered to learn about, values they had never taken time to understand, and a career they had dismissed as boring government work. Their presence at the award ceremony would be another attempt to claim reflected glory rather than genuine appreciation of my character and accomplishments. I had learned that their approval wasn't necessary for my success or my self-worth, and I no longer felt obligated to include them in celebrations of achievements they had never supported or encouraged. The award ceremony was everything I had hoped it would be, a room full of legal professionals who understood and respected the work I had dedicated my life to pursuing. The recognition felt earned and meaningful, based on years of dedication to justice rather than family connections or social obligations. My colleagues and mentors were there to celebrate with me, people who had seen my worth long before it became publicly obvious and who valued my contributions to the legal profession and the community. This was the validation that mattered. Respect earned through competence and integrity rather than demanded through family loyalty or social positioning. As I accepted the award and looked out at the audience of legal professionals who had gathered to honor prosecutors across the state, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The quiet strength that my family had mistaken for weakness had been recognized by judges, colleagues, and victims who had benefited from my dedication to justice. The boring government job they had dismissed had been revealed as meaningful work that protected communities from corruption and crime. The achievements they had ignored were being celebrated by people who understood their significance and value. My family watched the ceremony on live stream, finally seeing me in my natural element surrounded by colleagues who respected my expertise and valued my contributions. The contrast between their years of dismissal and the obvious respect I commanded in professional settings was stark and undeniable. They began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that their opinions of me had been wrong in fundamental ways and that their validation had never been necessary for my success or happiness. The woman they had underestimated had built a career and a reputation that extended far beyond their small world of family dynamics and petty jealousies. In the months that followed, my relationship with my family settled into a new dynamic based on mutual respect rather than their previous dismissal and my desperate need for approval. They learned to ask about my work with genuine interest, to celebrate my achievements without trying to take credit for them, and to treat me as an equal rather than the family member they had always felt sorry for. The transformation wasn't complete or entirely comfortable, but it represented progress toward healthier relationships based on understanding rather than assumptions. David and Emma's relationship eventually ended, destroyed by the weight of family disapproval and their own guilt about how they had treated me. The charm and excitement that had driven their affair couldn't survive the cold light of family judgment and community knowledge of their betrayal. Emma attempted several times to rebuild our relationship, but I had learned that trust, once broken by someone who claimed to love you, couldn't be easily repaired. We maintained polite contact at family gatherings, but the sisterly bond we had once shared was gone forever, replaced by cordial distance and mutual recognition of damage that couldn't be undone. The final chapter of this story isn't about revenge or vindictive satisfaction, but about the quiet triumph of living well and staying true to your values, even when the people closest to you fail to recognize your worth. My family's belated recognition of my achievements felt less important than my own understanding of my value and my commitment to work that made a difference in my community. The strength they had mistaken for weakness had carried me through law school, built my career, and sustained me through their dismissal and betrayal. Their approval, when it finally came, was welcome but no longer necessary for my happiness or self-respect. I had learned that the people who matter will see your worth without external validation, while those who don't see it probably never will, regardless of how much public recognition you receive. My grandmother had always known who I was, just as my colleagues had recognized my capabilities long before they became publicly obvious. The family members who required news coverage to appreciate my accomplishments had revealed their own limitations rather than discovered my hidden value. Real worth doesn't depend on other people's recognition, and genuine strength doesn't require external validation to exist or matter. Today, I continue my work as a prosecutor, taking on cases that protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit them. My family relationships have improved significantly based on their new understanding of who I am and what I've accomplished. The respect I always wanted from them came eventually, though it required public recognition to make it happen. More importantly, I learned that my worth was never dependent on their approval, and that the quiet strength they had dismissed was actually the foundation of everything meaningful in my professional and personal life. The woman they called a pushover had been quietly building a career dedicated to justice, earning the respect of colleagues and judges who valued competence over charm. The boring government worker they had dismissed was actually someone who fought for victims and held powerful criminals accountable for their actions. The weak sister who couldn't handle her marriage problems had been strong enough all along, strong enough to pursue justice, strong enough to maintain her integrity, and ultimately strong enough to stand up and show them exactly who she had always been.